we go. Now we can start. That was the longest minute in the world. Engels summarizes the inevitable solution to this contradiction: socialized ownership of the means of production, which can only be accomplished through proletarian social revolution. He describes such social revolution as the solution of the contradictions, including proletarian revolution, solution of the contradiction. The proletarian seizes the public power and by means of this transforms the socialized means of production, slipping from the hands of the bourgeoisie into public property. By this act, the proletarian frees the means of production from the character of capital. They have thus far borne and gives their socialized character complete freedom to work itself out. Socialized production upon the predetermined plan becomes henceforth possible. The development of production makes the existence of different classes of society thenceforth an anachronism. In proportion to anarchy in social production vanishes, and political authority of the state dies out. Man at last, the master of its own form of social organization, becomes at the same time the Lord, I don't agree with this, over nature, his own master. So he's saying nature is the master. Free to accomplish this act of universal emancipation is a historical mission of the modern proletariat, to thoroughly comprehend the historical conditions and thus the very nature of this act, to impart to the now oppressed proletarian class a full knowledge of the conditions and of the meaning of the momentous act it is called upon to accomplish. This is the task of the theoretical expression of the proletarian movement, scientific socialism. The formation and development of class in history can take place with different forms and different levels of different social communities, and depends on the specific impact of the objective and subjective factors on the motion and development process of each human community. Every human society has its own unique objective material conditions as well as subjective conditions. Therefore, every society develops in different ways. From this reason, every society will develop differently, even two societies that share the same relations of production. For example, one capitalist nation will develop differently than another capitalist nation. Even within a capitalist nation, one city might develop differently from the other. Now, no two human groups will ever develop in exactly the same way. Development will happen at different rates, with different phenomena and characteristics. In the book, Study of the Capitalist Class of Vietnam under French occupation, historians Nguyen, I can't say it, Nguyen Con Ben wrote, the capitalist class of Vietnam could only really exist once there was a big enough group of people that had their own economic status, and they started having contradictions with other economic groups that kept them from further development. Once that contradiction began, capitalist development, class consciousness to defend and fight for the benefit of their own class. For this reason, the capitalist class of Vietnam had its own process of development. The capitalist class started as a small group of traders and craftsmen in urban areas that produced small commodities. Once capitalists had developed factories in Vietnam, they began exploiting wage workers. Labor then became a commodity. The exploitation of the surplus value of workers became widespread. Commodity and monetary economies overcome the farming economy, and with this development, the capitalists had become fully developed as a class. By the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the early 20th century, new political and social conditions began to arise. French colonialists invaded and colonized Vietnam. The international capitalist economy, and predominantly the French capitalist economy, arrived in Vietnam and began to dramatically change the economy. The small and simple commodity economy of Vietnam suddenly and drastically developed. Over time, the people who had been exploited by the class of feudal lords came to be exploited instead by the French colony capitalist class. These conditions stimulated the rapid development of capitalists in Vietnam. In the earlier days of colonialism until late 19th century, the business of French capitalists in Vietnam was mostly limited to the trading and financial lending. The result of this was the emergence of the Vietnamese traders, and these traders were the seeds of capitalism in Vietnam. The French government at that time had a policy of monopoly control of foreign trade. Therefore, there existed some Vietnamese small capitalists who traded with French capitalists. This led to a formation of small businesses such as Quang Hung Domestic Trading Company in Hanoi. When France joined World War I, a need arose for a huge supply of resources from the colonies to aid the war effort. Vietnam was one of the most heavily affected colonies. This resulted the monopoly policy of French capitalists on foreign trade to be weakened. At that time, French government in Vietnam had reformed the economy to mobilize nearly all the resources of Vietnam to be delivered to France. Vietnam's economy depended tremendously on the French economy, and because of the war, France was unable to invest in Vietnam as much as before. Some Vietnamese capitalists took this as an opportunity to open their own factories in industries such as weaving, oil production, and leather goods, to domestically manufacture products such as Vietnam could no longer import, and an increasing number of capitalists began using their own money to build factories. Thus, we can see that colonialism and other factors had a major impact on the development of capitalism in Vietnam. Although the relations of production under capitalism in Vietnam were based on the same contradictions of capitalists exploiting wage workers, the capitalist class rose to prominence through much different circumstances in Vietnam than they did in most European countries. Likewise, the existence of colonial holdings such as Vietnam's impacted the way capitalism developed in France. This is the case in every human community. Class society develops differently based on the material conditions, subjective conditions, and many other factors. However, it is impossible to generalize the process of class formation and development in human communities in history into two basic forms, namely class formation and development, which takes place mainly with the influence of violent factors to separate out commodity producers within social community. Class formation and development, which uses economic relations to separate out commodity producers within a social community. In addition, in historical reality, there are societies impacted simultaneously by both factors. In the Vietnamese textbook, Philosophy of Marxist-Leninism explains that class society are replaced through processes of contradictions and negation throughout history. Every stage of development of class society has its own class structure. Each class structure includes two primary opposing classes. In the ancient slave society, for example, the primary classes were those who were enslaved and those who were the owners of slaves. Under feudalism, the primary classes were peasants and feudal lords. Under capitalism, the primary classes are capitalists and workers. The two primary classes of each society are the true products of that society. Simultaneously, there are the classes that determine the existence and the development of the productive forces of that society. The ruling class is the class that represents the essence of that society. The primary classes are defined by their relations of the means of production. Specifically within class society, the primary classes include the class which owns the means of production and the class which labors to operate the primary means of production. The primary means of production are the means of production which produce the most vital necessities of life. Economic class of feudalism. Primary class, feudal lords. Primary laboring class, peasants. Other classes, clergy, merchants, craftsmen, and guildsmen, etc. The feudal landlords were considered a primary class under feudalism because they owned the land, which was their primary means of production in a feudal agrarian society. The peasants were considered a primary class under feudalism because they worked the land to produce vital material needs of society which were needed to sustain human life. Economic classes of capitalism. Primary ruling class is bourgeoisie. Primary laboring class, the proletariat. Other classes, petite bourgeoisie and the lumpen proletariat. Thank you. Capitalists are considered a primary class under capitalism because they own the means of production of material needs of society, factories, farms, etc. Workers are considered a primary class because they operate those means of production. Every class is defined by the relations of other classes and to the means of production. I almost messed up. Take, for example, the primary relations of production of feudal societies. Primary ruling class feudal lords own primary means of production of land. Primary laboring class, the peasants, they work the land. Thank you. Relations between primary classes and primary means of productions under feudalism. One primary class, the feudal lords, is defined by its relationship with the means of production, the land. The other primary class, the peasants. Feudal lords own the land and force the peasants to labor on the land. Other primary classes, the peasants, is defined by its relationship with the means of production, the land. And the other primary classes, the feudal lords, the peasant labors on the land for the profit and benefit of the feudal lords. The means of production, primarily land, are owned by feudal lords and labored upon by the feudal lords. Together, these relationships define the relationships of production of feudal society. Primary ruling class, bourgeoisie, owns the means of production. Primary laboring class, proletariat, works the means of production. Primary means of production, advanced machinery, factories, technology, STEM, etc. Relations between primary classes and primary means of production under capitalism. One primary class, the bourgeoisie, is defined by its relationship with the means of production, factories, machines, logistic systems, etc. And the other primary class, the proletariat. Bourgeoisie owns the means of production and force the proletariat to labor on the means of production for wages in order to survive. The other primary class, the proletariat, is defined by its relationships with the means of production, and the other primary class, the bourgeoisie. The proletariat labor with the means of production for the profit of the capitalists. The means of production are owned by the bourgeoisie and the labor upon by the proletariat. As with feudalism, these relationships between the primary classes and the means of production define the relations of production of capitalist societies. The Vietnamese textbook, Philosophy of Marxist-Leninism, further explains such relationships. In addition to the two primary classes, each society has other non-primary or secondary classes. Among these social groups, some are the remnants of the old mode of production, such as enslaved people at the beginning of capitalism. There are also groups who are the seeds for the future mode of production, such as the capitalists, the workers of the factories at the end of feudal society. Moreover, every class-based society has intermediate classes which are determined by the current mode of production, an ever-present social division of class society. Such classes include the commoners in ancient slave society, the craftsmen and merchants of feudal society, and the peasant and the petty bourgeoisie in capitalist society. In every class-based society, there also exists intellectuals who play a very important role in the economy, politics, and culture, etc. You came off mute. What's up?
I'm ready to do the notes. I just messed up and didn't. I meant to stay on mute.
And it's supposed to be short notes, right?
No, it's the big giant notes because we were going to go back over the.
Oh my God. How long is that going to take?
I don't know. It's going to take as long as it takes.
Can we do the ones that we just started off with today?
No, because we got to review it yesterday.
But people are not going to remember what we went over. Okay.
That's why we're going to go over it again. All right. So we're studying class and the role of class struggle in the development of class society. And the definition of class is classes are large groups of people differing from each other by the place they occupy in a historically determined system of social production by their relation, in most cases fixed and formulated in law, to the means of production by their role in the social organization of labor, and consequently by the dimensions of the share of social wealth of which they dispose. The share of social wealth of which they dispose and the mode of acquiring it. These differences in status and opposites inevitably lead to one class being able to appropriate the labor of another. Thus, Lenin asserted, classes are groups of people, one of which can appropriate the labor of another, owing to the different places they occupy in a definite system of social economy. The essence of class division in a society is the division of people in a social community into the exploiters and the exploited. The state is the social institution which allows a ruling class to exploit and appropriate the labor of oppressed classes through violence and coercion. The state is also the social institution that has the greatest impact on the base. Social revolution thus constitutes the development of a new socio-economic formation which has its own class structure. In order for workers to end capitalism, a dictatorship of the proletariat must be established through social revolution. Once the process of social revolution is complete and all remnants of the capitalist base and superstructure have been negated, there will remain only one class, the united global proletariat. The mission of the working class is to build class consciousness, to enact social revolution, to build a worker state and dictatorship of the proletariat, and to eventually bring about an end to not just capitalism, but class society altogether and the development of a stateless, classless society. The pursuit of this mission is the principal pursuit of scientific socialism. In dialectical materialism, all things, phenomena, and ideas are defined in terms of internal and external relationships. Class, therefore, is defined by various internal and external relationships. The three primary relationships which define class include the relationship between politics and economy of a society. Politics encompasses aspects of society's superstructure related to control over and benefit from the state. Economics include processes and phenomena which are concerned with securing, providing, and distributing the material needs of life in human society. Political economic relations between groups of human beings. The most important relationship between groups of human beings within class society have to do with the means of production. Capitalists profit from the relationship and enforce these class relations through the control of the state and oppositional relationships between groups of human beings. Liberal and metaphysical interpretations of class might define classes based on different characteristics, such as the levels of income, wealth, and so on. Historical perspective of politics and economics. Dialectical materialism demands that we seek a comprehensive and historical perspective in the analysis of all things, phenomena, and ideas. The more deeply we understand the political relationships and the class struggle which underlies political struggle, the more accurate our understanding will be, and the more effective our activities which are based upon this understanding. In order to correctly analyze and solve problems of the political structure of society, It is necessary to not only master the concept of class from the Marxist-Leninist viewpoint, but also to master the concept of social stratification. For example, blue-collar workers, white-collar workers, expert workers, or civil servants, intellectuals, small farmers. Each class within class society is defined by internal and external relationships. This means that no class is monolithic or homogeneous. Rather, every class is defined by internal relationships between internal strata of that class. There are other ways to examine and classify strata within a class depending on the point of view of analysis and which relationships are being examined. For example, in some cultures and nations, relationships having to do with ethnicity, race, language, caste, or other such factors may play important or defining roles in understanding and distinguishing stratification of classes. It is common for tension and conflict to exist between different strata of the working class, and this must be understood in analyzing class conflict and class society. Stratification can also be defined by how members of a class relate specifically to the means of production. There's intellectuals, ideologists, and intellectual laborers. Intellectuals and class struggle. Intellectuals can belong to any economic class. Intellectuals may also serve the class interests of a different class than the one they occupy. Some of these bourgeois ideologists perform their labor for wages and are exploited by capitalists. Common misunderstandings about intellectuals and class society. Semantics is a philosophical field of inquiry that pertains to meaning and language. Semantics can lead to confusion and disagreement when different people have strong preferences about different definitions of words. This is especially problematic in metaphysical philosophy, which seeks to categorize all human knowledge into discrete, static, unchanging, specific categories. Metaphysical semantics generally seek to assign a very specific definition to every individual word. Dialectical materialist semantics differ from metaphysical semantics in a key way. In dialectical materialist analysis, words are discussed and defined based on internal and external relationships. In dialectical materialist analysis, it is important to avoid problems of metaphysical semantics, which can lead to unnecessary confusion or even intentional obfuscation and deception when used in bad faith. Intellectual labor may or may not define someone as a working class member of the proletariat. Whether or not an intellectual would be considered a worker or not depends on their relations to means of production, whether or not they own their own essential means of production, and whether or not they are wage workers who are exploited by capitalists for profit. Marx, Engels, and Lenin all wrote of intellectual labor and an intellectual proletariat, which refers to workers who primarily work with their minds and do not directly interface with the essential means of production in their labor. Engels interprets the intellectual proletariat as workers who perform intellectual labor. Lenin is defining an intellectual class in the economic sense, which would make intellectual workers a completely different part of the class structure of capitalism, separate from the working class. Lenin is attempting to explain why intellectuals of all classes within the capitalist political economy have a strong tendency to serve the agenda of the ruling class, and how this tendency tends to lead to conflict and antagonism between intellectuals and the majority of the working class. In Lenin's explanation, intellectual laborers are a special stratum of the working class which have unique properties. This means that intellectuals have a tendency to side with whichever class will give them the most benefits, and this leads to an overwhelming tendency to intellectuals supporting the ruling class. To put it another way, Lenin was a proletarian ideologist because he developed and furthered the ideology of the proletariat as a revolutionary class. Lenin, Marx, and Engels all identified the tendency for division between intellectual laborers and manual laborers within the working class. Origin of class. The discovery of class antagonism, and class struggle were not a new discovery of Marxism-Leninism. However, one of the new and fundamental findings of Marxism-Leninism was that class antagonism, and class struggle are neither the nature of humanity nor a predestined law, but only historical phenomenon. The direct origin of class division in society is the birth and existence of the private ownership of the means of production, and especially private ownership of the primary means of production in society. Private ownership of the means of production alone is not sufficient to give rise to the separation into classes within society. There have existed in the past various human societies which are not class societies. By studying the development of human society with a comprehensive and historical perspective, Marx and Engels discovered that class society emerged from material and objective processes related to the development of productive forces and corresponding relations of production. Class society emerged as productive forces reached a level where private ownership of the primary means of production became the most suitable relations of production. Class society emerged from the development of surplus labor time. Marx defined surplus labor time in capital as the time which a worker spends laboring after producing enough labor value to account for their own reproduction. To put it another way, surplus labor time is all the time a worker works in excess of the value of that worker's wages. Over time, as productive forces develop, their suitability with the current relations of production decrease more and more. This means that eventually, once the unsuitability reaches a certain threshold, that mode of production will end and another will take its place. In the capitalist era, the productive forces continuously become increasingly unsuitable to the relations of production of capitalism. Previous modes of production, which existed in class societies before capitalism, had much lower development of productive forces. The development of capitalism and the development of productive forces led to the socialization of productive forces, meaning that the means of production began to require increasingly concentrated and collectivized operation and use. These more socialized and collective means of production came to be owned privately by a smaller and smaller number of capitalists. Engels further elaborates that socialized productive forces and the capitalist mode of production gradually and steadily developed well beyond the productive forces of feudal society and individualized productive forces. Engels also highlights that although the means of production came to be used by workers on a socialized basis, the means of production continued to be owned privately by certain individuals, the emerging capitalist class. Engels identifies a dialectical contradiction between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, arising from the fact that the operation of the means of production has become socialized, while the ownership of the means of production remains individualized. This contradiction means that the productive forces of capitalist society are unsuitable with capitalist relations of production. The development of the capitalist mode of production eventually overtook and negated the feudal mode of production. However, the contradiction and unsuitability between the socialized productive forces and the individualized ownership of the means of production has led to an inherent instability and class struggle within capitalist society. Socialized ownership of the means of production, which can only be accomplished through proletarian social revolution. So that's important to know. The formation and development of class in history can take place with different forms and different levels in different social communities, and depend on the specific impact of objective and subjective factors on the motion and development process of each human community. Each human society has its own unique objective material conditions as well as subjective conditions. Therefore, every society develops in different ways. For this reason, every society will develop differently, even two societies that share the same relations of production. The existence of colonial holdings, such as Vietnam, impacted the way capitalism developed in France. This is the case in every human community. Class society develops differently based on material conditions, subjective conditions, and many other factors. However, it is possible to generalize the process of class formation and development in human communities in history into two basic forms, namely class formation and development, which takes place mainly with the influence of violent factors to separate out commodity producers within the social community, and class formation and development, which uses economic relations to separate out commodity producers within the social community. In addition, in historic reality, there are societies impacted simultaneously by both factors. The primary classes are defined by their relations to the means of production, specifically within class society. As with feudalism, relationships between the primary classes and the means of production define the relations of production of capitalist society. And then that's where we're at. 3.
Thanks. Number 3, of class struggle in the motion of development of class society. According to Lenin, class struggle is a struggle waged by the masses and those who have no rights are oppressed and engaged in toil against the privileged, the oppressors, and drones. A struggle of wage laborers or proletarians against the property owners of bourgeoisie. Based on this definition, the essence of class struggle is the struggle for those who are politically oppressed and economically exploited, i.e. slaves, serfs, wage workers, against that oppression and exploitation in order to resolve the conflicts of economic and political interests between the oppressor classes and the oppressed classes to different extents and degrees. Depending on different historical conditions, class struggle is different. So society can take many different forms with different scopes and levels, such as economic struggles, ideological struggles, political struggles, etc. Throughout history, class struggle has also taken on forms such as national struggle, religious struggle, culture, and various other forms. Suggestions is simply a way of referring to dialectical contradictions between the two opposing sides. Class struggle is, therefore, a particular type of contradiction in which two or more classes contradict with one another. The underlying relationships of class society which lead to these contradictions are outlined. Class struggle always involves the means of production, namely, who has control over the means of production and who benefits from them. These contradictions of class struggle can take various forms in human society, including, not but limiting to, economic struggle over the means of production, the material necessity of human life. For example, under feudalism, serfs struggle for a greater share of the crops, which they invest in harvested, and for access to more common land, with feudal lords struggling to take a greater share from the serfs who toil beneath them and to share less of their wealth with the lords to which they owned feltly. Under capitalism, workers struggle for higher wages and better access to social services, such as healthcare and retirement benefits, while capitalists struggle to pay less in taxes and to pay their workers less so that they can enjoy more profit. Ideological struggle over social consciousness forms within the superstructure of society. This is important because false consciousness can hinder and even work against a class. If it is widespread, whereas class consciousness and awareness of true nature of class society can offer great advantages in political and economic struggle. For example, during the feudal era in many nations, noble lords and clergy sought to build up within social consciousness of serfs the idea that the king had the divine right to rule from God and that serfs were serving their role in God's order by living a life of service to their landlords. Today, under capitalism, the ruling class wages ideological warfare against the working class to convince workers that capitalism is a system which would serve them best and to prevent workers from building class consciousness. This slows the progress of political struggle and even causes a large fraction of workers, even the majority in many countries, to actually serve the interests of the ruling class. Hold on a second. There we go. Political struggle over power. Political struggle over power and control within the state, the legal apparatus of society. Political struggle primarily takes place through political parties. These are social institutions which exist to develop political consciousness, forms, and ideology to train leaders and to build power for the class which controls them. Political struggle is important because the state is the social institution which has the most impact on the material base of society, and so building power with or against the state is the most effective way for a class to impact the base. Political struggle also leads to social revolution, which is the only way a class can change its position to becoming the ruling class of society. National struggle has developed along with the social institutions of nations. Nations are social groups of human beings which have developed a common identity over time based on the factors such as language, shared history, geographical regions, etc. National identity are complex political phenomena which dialectically relate and contradict with other social institutions such as states, political parties, and movements, and so on. National struggle can take various forms. In some cases, national struggle can lead to nationalist chauvinism, which is a form of false consciousness, in which the workers are mistakenly led to believe in the false consciousness that their national identity is exceptional or superior to other nationalities, and that national identity and struggle should be prioritized over class struggle. Other forms of national struggle, such as the struggle for colonized nations to develop independence and self-determination, and to end colonial and imperial subjugation, can be positive developments, so long as they are aligned with class consciousness and the international mission of scientific socialism. It is important, therefore, to distinguish positive characteristics, such as national independence movements of colonized peoples, which can be developed to facilitate class struggle, from a negative characteristic, such as chauvinism or supremacism, which impede class struggle and divide the international working class. Ho Chi Minh warned communists against nationalist chauvinism in a speech he delivered in 1967. The declaration of this conference reminds us of the need to strengthen education in the spirit of Marxist-Leninism and to fight against opportunist tendencies such as bourgeoisie nationalism, chauvinism, dogmatism, and revisionism. It should also be noted that many communists, including Ho Chi Minh, have been described as nationalists by bourgeoisie ideologists in an effort to conflate anti-colonial communist struggles with nationalist chauvinism. Ho Chi Minh himself distinguished between the struggle of colonized workers and nationalist chauvinists. In an interview with a foreign journalist in December 1965, Ho Chi Minh said, "It is probably not true to say that when I was young, I followed, quote, nationalism, because at the time, I only knew how to love my compatriots, but I did not know any isms. When I went to Africa, I saw the colonial people were also suffering, oppressed, and exploited, like the people of Indochina. When I went to European countries, I saw that there were also some rich people being syncurists, i.e. benefiting from positions which require very little work, and the working people were very poor. I thought a lot about these things. At the time, the Great October Revolution had succeeded in Russia. Lenin had organized the Communist International. Then Lenin developed the thesis on the colonial question. Those things made me realize that the working people of Indochina, the people of the colonies, and all the working people who want to liberate themselves must unite and make a revolution. Therefore, I became a Marxist-Leninist. It is clear from the words and actions of Ho Chi Minh that Vietnamese communists, that the nationalism they observed was limited to a struggle of national independency from colonial rule. This nationalism of colonized communists is not supremacist in nature and exists in the spirit of national and internationalist collaboration of the working classes around the world and across national boundaries, and should not be conflated with national chauvinism and bourgeoisie nationalism, which seeks to advance the interest of one nation over others. Religious struggles is the struggle of religious institutions, social forms to develop, survive, grow, and overtake other religions in human society. For example, of this form from Vietnamese history was the religious struggles of Buddhists in the 1960s during the dictatorship of Ngo Dinh Diem and his puppet government. This government promoted a form of Catholic chauvinism which sought to oppress all other religious forms and lead to an uprising of Buddhists to help overthrow Ngo Dinh Diem and his regime. Cultural struggles is the struggle for human culture to develop with human societies. From Ho Chi Minh on culture and struggles is as it pertains to Vietnam. Note that all these forms of struggles are dialectically related and reinforce one another. For instance, effective ideological struggles can lead to the building and strengthening of political parties, which will enhance efforts of political struggle. Political struggle building power within the state can lead to a passage of legislation and other legal progress, which may benefit a class in economic struggle. Understanding the dynamics of dialectical relationships associated with class struggle is very important to the mission of scientific socialism. To control and suppress the class struggle of laborers and slaves in order to maintain and implement their exploitation, the ruling class through history, i.e. slave owners, feudal lords, and the bourgeoisie, have inevitably resorted to organized violence. This violence has taken the form of the state, which uses armed forces and legal systems to maintain their class dominance. Therefore, the issue of state authority and state power is a central and fundamental issue of class struggle in society. Any class struggle that does not solve the problem of seizing state power cannot solve the most fundamental problem of class struggle. However, not every class struggle identifies that state authority and state power as the central issue. Only when the development of class struggle reaches the level of political struggle will that issue become a central and fundamental issue. The issue of seizing state power is also a fundamental problem of all social revolutions, as the peak of development of class struggle. The birth and existence of the state is a result of class struggle within society that has class antagonisms. All social contradictions have been pushed to the point of being unresolvable. It is inevitable that the ruling class will need to use force of violence to maintain the orderly society which serves its own will and interest. The state came into being and exists today not to resolve contradictions, but to maintain social order in conditions of unresolvable contradictions. Through over 2,000 years of human society, there have been several distinct types of states, including the slave-owning state of ancient times, the feudal state of the Middle Ages, and the bourgeoisie state in capitalist countries in our present time. These states existed as instruments for organized violence aimed at controlling the class struggle of the working class. Although each type of state can exist in many different forms, with many different names, central and decentralized forms of monarchy, constitutional monarchy, aristocratic republics, representative republics, presidential republics, etc. Their class nature remains the same. The state stands as an instrument of class dictatorship, with existing to exploit classes of slaves or laborers. unlike the above mentioned type of states. The dictatorship of the proletariat exists as a new type of state, a half state, a state without its literal meaning, existing in a period of transition towards communism. The dictatorship of the proletariat is an institution, is an instrument of organized violence, and a tool of social economic management controlled by the working class and the working people. Socialism, utopian, and scientific, Engels explains the importance of workers taking control of the state in order to develop a dictatorship of the proletariat in a way in which capitalism itself creates the necessary objective conditions which will allow workers to seize control of the state, whilst the capitalist mode of production more and more completely transforms the great majority of the population into proletarians. It creates a power. And another one! Look at me! There we go. That's the second one, everybody. Creates the power which, under penalty, let me read this. Whilst the capitalist mode of production more and more completely transforms the great majority of the population into proletarians, it creates the power which, under penalty of its own destruction, is forced to accomplish this revolution, whilst its force on more and more of the transformation of the vast means of production already socialized into state property. It shows itself the way to accomplishing this revolution. The proletarian seizes political power and turns the means of production into state property. Engels also explains how the dictatorship of the proletariat will ultimately lead to the end of not only itself, but all states and class societies moving forward. But in seizing political power and turning the means of all class distinctions and class antagonism, abolish also the state as state. Approved? No, appeal not approved. Engels then explains the essential differences between the dictatorship of the proletariat and all preceding states and forms of class society. Society thus far based upon class antagonism had need of the state, that is, of the organization of a particular class which has no temporal, and the exploiting class, an organization for the purpose of preventing any interference from without with the existing conditions of production, and therefore, especially for the purpose of foreseeably keeping the exploited classes in the conditions of oppression, corresponding with the given mode of production, slavery, serfdom, wage labor, the state as the official representative of society as the whole, the gathering of it together into a visible embodiment. But it was this only in so far as it was the state of that class which itself represents, for the time being, society as a whole. An accident in ancient times, the state of slave-owning citizens, in Middle Ages, the feudal lords, in our own times, the bourgeoisie. When at least it becomes a real representative of the whole society, it renders itself unnecessary. In other words, once the working class takes control of the state and establishes a dictatorship of the proletariat, the conditions will eventually develop for the end of class society and the necessity and the conditions for the existence of a state together. As soon as there is no longer any social class to be held in subjugation, as soon as class rule and the individual struggles for existence based on our present anarchy in production, with the collisions and excesses arising from these are removed, nothing more remains to be repressed, and a special representative force, a state, is no longer necessary. The first act by virtue of which the state really constitutes itself the representative of the whole society, and taking possession of the means of production in the name of society. This is at the same time, at least, its last independent act as a state. State interference in social relation becomes, in one domain after another, superfluous. Superfluous means it fades away, there's no need for it. and then dies out of itself. The government of persons is replaced by the administration of things and by the conduct of process of production. The state is not abolished. Class struggle serves as a basic mode and driving force of social progress and development in the conditions of social division, that is class antagonism. According to the historical materialist viewpoint, since class division has existed, stretching back in history and through to the present day, human history is, in essence, a history of class struggle, as it manifests in various forms with different degrees and with different nuances. Class struggle was the struggle of the slaves against the oppression of the slave owning class. It was a struggle of serfs and peasants against the oppression and exploitation of the nobles and kings. It is the struggle of wage workers against the oppression and exploitation of the bourgeoisie. In every form of class society, class struggle has eventually led to social revolution, which gives rise to a new mode of production. Therefore, class society can only be developed through the resolution of social, political, and economic antagonisms of class. In other words, through class struggle. In this sense, class struggle is not only the driving force of historical development, but also mode of social progress and development. Take into consideration the theory of social economic formation. It follows that most fundamental mode and driving force of social progress and development is the motion of mode of production in society. A mode is the way or manner in which something exists. According to historical materialism, then it can be understood that the development of class society exists in the mode of class struggle. This simply means that class society develops because of the internal contradictions between different classes, which together define class society within a given stage of development. In addition to class struggle, many other contradictions exist within human society. Such contradictions and struggles are detailed and listed, an annotation, and including religious struggles, national struggles, and so on. None of these other struggles and contradictions, however, define the development of human society from one stage of development, i.e. mode of production, to the next. Only class struggle advances human society forward by fundamentally developing the material base and productive forces of human society. Class struggle is, in essence, the contradiction which occurs in the social being and material base of human society. All other forms of struggle, national struggle, etc., are struggles which occur within the superstructure of society. The dialectical materialist perspective indicates that material determines human consciousness, whereas consciousness can only impact back on the material. Thus, it follows that class struggle determines all other forms of social consciousness struggle, while social consciousness struggles can impact upon class struggle. Ethnic struggle under feudalism, it was determined by the nature of feudal class society and class struggle. The essence of ethnicities which dominate the primary mean, i.e. ethnicities which had a high concentration of feudal lords, were social dominant over ethnicities which were predominantly peasants. For example, English invaders of Ireland developed and maintained dominance over Irish people through the development of feudal land holdings in Ireland. As feudalism gave way to capitalism, the nature of ethnic domination changed. Instead of dominating Ireland through feudal class relations, Irish workers became proletarianized and dominated through English capitalism. Under both feudalism and capitalism, the ethnic struggles between English people and Irish people was determined by the underlying class struggle. However, it is also true that those ethnic struggles impact back on class struggle. For example, when Ireland secured potential independency from England in weakening English capitalism in most of Ireland, and also led to a more predominant development of an Irish bourgeoisie. Vietnam had the similar pattern of development. The Chinese people were dominated by French colonialists who, oh my gosh, I have to do a picture now. Come on. Hey, I did it the first time. Vietnam had a similar pattern of development. The Vietnamese people were dominated by French colonialists who co-opted the feudal material base of society to implement colonialism. The ethnic struggle between French colonizers and Vietnamese natives was determined by French control of the means of production, which was taken by force and through the subjugations of the Vietnamese feudal lords and monarchy. The ethnic struggle between the Vietnamese and French colonizers did impact upon the material base and class struggle, but was essentially determined by class struggle. The class analysis of this history is explained in further detail. However, in class society, the motions of the mode of production becomes an antagonistic conflict between classes in society. These economic contradictions can only be resolved through political struggle between the opposing classes. Thus, class struggle was becoming a political mechanism to resolve contradictions in mode of production and to fulfill the objective needs to develop the productive forces which drive the development of human society. The role of development of the productive forces is primary driver of development of human society. Political struggle and social revolutions are discussed more in detail in the following section. All right, your turn.
Okay. All right, let's go to the bookmark. Okay, the role of class struggle in the motion and development of class society. According to Lenin, class struggle is a struggle waged by the masses of those who have no rights, are oppressed and engage in toil against the privileged, the oppressors, and drones, a struggle of the wage laborers or proletarians against the property owners or bourgeoisie. The essence of class struggle is the struggle of those who are politically oppressed and economically exploited. Against that oppression and exploitation, in order to resolve the conflict of economic and political interests between the oppressor classes and the oppressed classes to different extents and degrees. Throughout history, class struggle has also taken on forms such as national struggle, religious struggle, cultural, and various other forms. Struggle is simply a way of referring to dialectical contradiction between two opposing sides. Different struggles are class struggle, economic struggle, ideological struggle, political struggle, national struggle, religious struggle, and cultural struggle. It should also be noted that many communists, including Ho Chi Minh, have been described as nationalists by bourgeois ideologists in an effort to conflate anti-colonial communist struggle with nationalist chauvinism. Ho Chi Minh himself distinguished between the struggles of colonized workers and national chauvinists. It is clear from the words and actions of Ho Chi Minh and Vietnamese communists that the nationalism they observed was limited to a struggle for national independence from colonial rule. This nationalism of colonized communists is not supremacist in nature and exists in the spirit of international collaboration of the working classes around the world and across national boundaries, and should not be conflated with national chauvinism and bourgeois nationalism, which seek to advance the interests of one nation over others. All these forms of struggle are dialectically related and reinforce one another. Understanding the dynamics and dialectical relationships associated with class struggle is very important to the mission of scientific socialism. To control and suppress the class struggles of laborers and enslaved people, and in order to maintain and implement their exploitation, the ruling classes throughout history have inevitably resorted to organized violence. This violence has taken the form of the state, which uses armed forces and legal systems to maintain their class dominance. The issue of state authority and state power is the central and fundamental issue of class struggle in society. Only when the development of class struggle reaches the level of political struggle will that issue become the central and fundamental issue. The issue of seizing state power is also the fundamental problem of all social revolutions as the peak of the development of class struggle. The state came into being and exists today not to resolve contradictions, but to maintain social order in conditions and unresolvable contradictions. Although each type of state can exist in many different forms with many different names, their class nature remains the same. The state stands as an instrument of class dictatorship, which exists to exploit classes of the enslavers or laborers. The dictatorship of the proletariat is an instrument of organized violence and a tool of socio-economic management controlled by the working class and the working people. Engels said, whilst the capitalist mode of production more and more completely transforms the great majority of the population into proletarians, it creates the power which, under penalty of its own destruction, is forced to accomplish this revolution. But in seizing political power and turning the means of production into state property, it abolishes itself as proletariat, abolishes all class distinction and class antagonisms, abolishes also the state as state. Society thus far, based upon class antagonisms, has need of the state. The state was the official representative of society as a whole, the gathering of it together into a visual embodiment. But it was this only insofar as it was the state of the class which itself represented. For the time being, society as a whole, in ancient times, the state of slave-owning citizens, and more recent. In the Middle Ages, the feudal lords. In our own times, the bourgeoisie. When at last it becomes the real representative of the whole of society, it renders itself unnecessary. And then she went on to say, as soon as there is no longer any social class to be held in subjection, as soon as class rule and the individual struggle for existence, based upon our present anarchy in production, with the collisions and excesses arising from these, are removed, nothing more remains to be repressed, and a special repressive force, a state, is no longer necessary. The state is not abolished, it dies out. Class struggle serves as the basic mode and driving force of social progress and development in the condition of social division that is class antagonism. Human history is, in essence, a history of class struggle as it manifests in various forms and with different degrees and with different nuances. In every form of class society, class struggle has eventually led to social revolution, which gives rise to a new mode of production. Therefore, class society can only be developed through the resolution of social, political, and economic antagonisms of class. In other words, through class struggle. In this sense, class struggle is not only the driving force of historical development, but also the mode of social progress and development. A mode is the way or manner in which something exists. According to historical materialism, then, it can be understood that the development of class society exists in the mode of class struggle. In addition to class struggle, many other contradictions exist within human society. For example, religious struggle, national struggle, and so on. None of these other struggles and contradictions, however, define the development of human society from one stage of development to the next. Class struggle is, in essence, the contradiction which occurs in the social being and material base of human society. Class struggle determines all other forms of social consciousness struggle, while social consciousness struggles can impact back upon class struggle. As feudalism gave way to capitalism, the nature of ethnic domination changed. Instead of dominating Ireland through feudal class relations, Irish workers became proletarianized and dominated through English capitalism. In class society, the motion of the mode of production becomes an antagonistic conflict between classes in society. These economic contradictions can only be resolved through political struggle between the opposing classes. Thus, class struggle has become a political mechanism to resolve contradictions in modes of production and to fulfill the objective need to develop the productive forces which drives the development of human society. That's it.
All right, here we go. Section 2, social revolution and their roles in the development of class society. Definition of social revolution and its cause. In a broad sense, social revolution is a qualitative landmark, change in all aspects of social life. It is the method of transition from the outdated social economic formation to a new higher level of development. In a narrow sense, social revolution is the overthrowing of an outdated political system and establishing a more progressive political regime run by the revolutionary class. It should be noted that not all political actions commonly referred to as revolution. In a society are true social revolutions in a historical materialist sense of the term. For example, the feudal society where there may have been a political revolution in which one monarch deposed another monarch and took power over the feudal state. This would not be considered a social revolution in a historical materialist sense of terms, because in a sense of the term, because the mode of production and the ruling class has not been essentially changed. Similarly, in one bourgeoisie-dominated party within a capitalist state is overthrown and replaced by another bourgeoisie-dominated party, then that would not constitute a social revolution. Instead, within the historical materialist framework, such as revolution, in which power does not shift from one economic class to another, would simply be known as the coup d'etat. In a society with class antagonism, such as social revolution, is characterized by armed insurrection and revolutionary classes to seize state power. Social revolution also involves the organization, construction, and use of a new state by a revolutionary class to fundamentally and comprehensively renovate all aspects of society. That is to say, the successful social revolution is the beginning of a new socio-economic formation. This means that the problem of state authority is a fundamental problem of all social revolution. At the same time, every social revolution must go through two stages: the stage of taking power and the stage of organizing and building a new state and a new society. Social revolution is different from the concept of reform. Reform refers to changes that take place in one or several areas of social life within a social economic formation in order to improve economic formation. Examples of reform include economic institutional reform, national administrative reform, educational reform, etc. Social revolution is the process by which a progressive class overtakes the existing ruling class within society and brings about a new mode of production. Through this process, the revolutionary progress, class construction, a state to preserve and enforce its new agenda and position as a ruling class. The role of the state in human society is described more. Reform refers to the development which takes place within an existing mode of production. In terms of materialist dialectics, reform is a process of change and motion to the material base or superstructure of society, which does not constitute a quality shift and negation of the mode of production. The economic institutional reform would include change and development in an economic institution of society, which as banks and markets. An example of economic institution reform in the United States would be moving from a global standard system of currency to a fiat monetary system in 1971. This led to fundamental changes in economic institution of the United States, but did not lead to a change in class relations nor a change in the mode of production. National administrative reforms refers to change and development in the state itself, such as a change in the leading political party or elected official, or change to structure of or constitution of the state itself, which changes may alter the ways in which the ruling class governs the state, but they do not change which class governs the state, so they exist only as a measure of reform. Education reform includes changing the development within educational institutions of society. Examples would include the development of public schools, changes to university systems, development of vocational training for workers, etc. The concept of social revolution is also different from the concept of coup d'etat. A coup d'etat is a struggle for state power status between political factions of the ruling class, which with no intention of changing class relations. Coup d'etats can be peaceful or violent. The root cause of social revolution is sharp contradictions within the material production of society itself. This contradiction exists between the objective need for development and the productive forces on one side, and the obsolescent. I can't say it. I can't say that word. Are you there? Can you help me say the word? Hello? No? Okay, I guess I'll look it up in my mouth. We're back, everybody. It's obsolescence of relations of production, which are maintained through force by the ruling class. And on the other side, this contradiction cannot be resolved by any economic or political reforms that manifest as class struggle. It is the development of this class struggle that inevitably leads to an outbreak of social revolution. Coup d'etat is French for stroke of state. The more precise translation would be a sudden decisive exercise of force as applied to the state. A coup d'etat is essentially hold on, let me look at this word again. All right, I'll just say it. FUAS revolution.
It's faux.
Thank you. In the sense that state power does not change hands, but remains in control of the same ruling class. To put it another way, it is the change over power from one faction of the ruling class to another. In terms of the economic mode of production, the ruling class remains unchanged, and the mode of production does not shift from one form to another. Historical examples of coup d'etat, which did not result in the change of the mode of production, includes the rise of the National Socialist Party under Schmittler, 1930s, which replaced the government of Weimar Germany. The revolution, which took place from 1979 to 1987 in the Republic of Korea, which ended the dictatorship of Ping Ching-yi and placed different bourgeoisie-controlled political parties in power. The independence granted to Australia from the government of the United Kingdom. Although this transition took place peacefully and without much turmoil, it still constituted a fundamental changeover in control over the state from one faction of bourgeoisie to another, and can therefore be considered a sort of coup d'etat in a historical materialist sense of the term. Although each of these political events led to great changes and developments, which each respective nations, they did not lead to essential change of the mode of production and class relations. In each case, the capitalist class remained a dominant class, and the proletariat remained oppressed through the capitalist mode of production. Only the revolution, which replaces the ruling class with a revolutionary class as the dominant class of society, can be considered to be a social revolution in a historical materialist sense of the term. Such revolution will lead to a major shift in human society as it negates of the old mode of production and ushers in a new mode of production. Social revolution is always preceded by development of the productive forces to such extent that they are no longer compatible with the existing relations of production. This must be understood that social revolution is not brought about by individual human beings, nor through human will, but as a result of objective development of the material base of society. This is explained in more detail. Any revolution which does not lead to a new mode of production, a new relations of production, is essentially an act of reform and or coup d'etat. In addition, such revolution is impacted by subjective factors. The most important subjective factor is the cognitive and organizational development of the revolutionary class, i.e., the class that represents the new mode of production. From this cognitive and organizational development, class struggles advances from spontaneous action to self-conscious actions. Once the subjective and objective causes has sufficiently ripened, the social revolutionary seizes the revolutionary movement. Then it is inevitable that the social revolution will explode and potentially succeed. An example, as explained in 95, subjective factors are factors which can vary across time and place, and which can vary from the one location to another, even within same social formations of human society. The importance of developing class consciousness is a prerequisite of social revolution. Hold on before you do it, because look, we're on page 245. We only have two more pages and it's the end of the chapter. So I'm going to go and continue. Is that okay?
And then you're going to have me do all the notes?
Yes.
Sounds good.
2. The role of the social revolutions in the development of class society. Social revolution is the mode and driving force of social development. Without social revolution in history, a process of replacing any given social economic formation with a newer, higher level of social economic formation would not have taken place. With that in mind, Marx affirmed that revolutions are the locomotives of history, the mode of development, social economic formation. On the other hand, it is thanks to social revolution that development contradictions of society in the fields of economy, politics, culture, etc., have been resolved, thereby creating a motivation for the progress and development of society. During revolutionary periods, the creative capacity of the masses have been brought into full play, leading to extraordinarily rapid historical developments. One day is equal to 20 years. Human history has fully and clearly demonstrated the role of social revolution that have taken place in the past millennia. Those include the social revolution that made the transition from the original social economic formation into the slave-owning social economic formation, the revolution that abolished slavery and replaced it with feudal, the bourgeoisie revolution that toppled the feudal system and established a capitalist regime, the proletarian revolution that abolished the bourgeoisie dictatorship and established a socialist regime. So far, the greatest and most profound revolution in human history, which completely changed the nature of the old socio-political system by thoroughly abolishing the private ownership system that caused class antagonism to begin with, and which has existed for thousands of years in human history. Socialism, utopian and scientific, Engels summarizes the history of social revolution, starting with the description of medieval feudal society. 1. Medieval society. Individual production of small-scale means of production, adapted for individuals' use, hence primitive, ungainly, petty, dwarfed in action, production for immediate consumption, either for the producer himself or his feudal lord. Only where an access of production over this consumption occurs is such access offered for sale. Enter into exchange. Production of commodities, therefore, only in its infancy, but already it contains within itself an embryo, anarchy, in the production of society at large. Next, Engels describes how capitalists performed social revolutions to become the new ruling class. 2. Capitalist revolution. Transformation of industry, at first by means of simple cooperation in manufacture, concentrations of the means of production hitherto scattered into great workshops. As a consequence, their transformation from individual to social means of production, the transformation which does not, on the whole, affect and form of exchange. The old forms of appropriation remain in force. The capitalist appear in his capacity as owner of the means of production. He also appropriates the products and turns them into commodity. Production has become a social act. Exchange and appropriation continues to be individual acts, the acts of individuals. The social products is appropriate by the individual capitalist. Fundamental contradiction whence arise all the contradictions in which all present-day society moves, in which modern industry brings to light. Engels next describes important factors of capitalist revolution. Surveillance of the producers from the means of production, condemnation of the worker, of wage labor, of life, antagonisms between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, growing predominance in the increasing effectiveness of the laws governing the the production of commodities, unbridled competition, contradictions between socialized organized individual factories and social anarchy in the production of as a whole. On the other hand, perfecting of machinery made by competition compulsory for each individual manufacturer and complemented by the constantly growing displacement of laborers, industrial reserve armies. On the other hand, ultimate extensions of production, also compulsory under competition for every manufacturer. On both sides, unheard of development of productive forces, excess of supply over demand, overproduction and products, excess there of laborers without employment and without means of existence. But these two levers of production of the social well-being are unable to work together because the capitalist form of production prevents the productive forces from working and the products from circulating unless they are first turned into capital, which their very superabundance prevents. The contradictions has grown into an absurdity. The mode of production rise in rebellion against the form of exchange. Partial recognition of the social character of the productive forces forced upon the capitalists themselves, taking over the great institutions of productions and communication, first by joint stock companies, later by trust, then by the state. Bourgeoisie demonstrates to be a superfluous class. All its social functions are now performed by salary employees. Finally, Engels predicts the outcome of proletarian revolution with which will end class society together. 3. Proletarian revolution. Solutions of the contradiction. The proletariat seizes public power, and by means of this transforms the socialized means of production, slipping from the hands of the bourgeoisie into public property. By this act, the proletariat frees the means of production from the character of capital. They have thus, and gives their socialized character complete freedom to work itself out. Socialized production upon the predetermined plan becomes henceforth possible. The development of production makes the existence, anarchy, in social production vanish. The political authority of the state dies out. Man, at least the master of his own form of social organization, becomes at the same time the lord over nature, his own master free. And that's it, chapter 6. Go ahead.
Okay. 2. Social revolutions and their role in the development of class society. Definition of social revolution and its causes. In a broad sense, social revolution is a qualitative landmark change in all aspects of social life. It is a method of transitioning from an outdated social economic formation to a new higher level of development. In a narrow sense, social revolution is the overthrow of an outdated political system and the establishment of a more progressive political regime run by the revolutionary class. It should be noted that not all political actions commonly referred to as revolutions in society are true social revolutions in the historical materialist sense of the term. If one bourgeois-dominated party within a capitalist state is overthrown and replaced with another bourgeois-dominated party, then that would not constitute a social revolution. The successful social revolution is the beginning of a new social-economic formation. This means that the problem of state authority is the fundamental problem of all social revolutions. Social revolution is different from the concept of reform. Reform refers to changes which take place in one or several areas of social life within a social-economic formation in order to improve that social-economic formation. Social revolution is the process by which a progressive class overtakes the existing ruling class within society and brings about a new mode of production. Reform refers to development which takes place within an existing mode of production. In terms of materialist dialectics, reform is a process of change and motion to the material base and/or superstructure of society, which does not constitute a quality shift and negation of the mode of production. Then three common reforms are economic institutional reform, national administrative reform, and education reform. The concept of social revolution is also different from the concept of a coup d'etat. A coup d'etat is a struggle for state power status between political factions of the ruling class with no intention of changing class relations. Coup d'etats can be peaceful or violent. The root cause of social revolution is sharp contradiction within the material production of society itself. This contradiction exists between the objective need for development of the productive forces on one side and the obsolescence of relations of production on the other side. A coup d'etat is a changeover in power from one faction of the ruling class to another. In terms of the economic mode of production, the ruling class remains unchanged and the mode of production does not shift from one form to another. Historical examples of coup d'etats which did not result in a change in the mode of production include Schmittler, the revolutions which took place in 1979 to 87 in the Republic of Korea, which ended the dictatorship of Park Chung-hee and placed different bourgeois-controlled political parties in power, the independence granted to Australia from the government of the United Kingdom. Although each of these political events led to great changes and developments within each respective nation, they did not lead to essential changes in the mode of production and class relations. Only a revolution which replaces the ruling class with a revolutionary class as the dominant class of society can be considered to be a social revolution in the historical materialist sense of the term. Social revolution is always preceded by development of the productive forces to such extent that they are no longer compatible with existing relations of production. Any, quote, revolution which does not lead to a new mode of production and new relations of production is essentially an act of reform and/or a coup d'etat. Each social revolution is impacted by subjective factors. The most important subjective factor is the cognitive and organizational development of the revolutionary class. Once the subjective and objective causes have sufficiently ripened and the revolutionary seizes the revolutionary moment, then it is inevitable that a social revolution will explode and potentially succeed. Subjective factors are factors which can vary across time and place and which can vary from one location to another even within the same social formation of human history. 2. The role of social revolution in the development of class society. Social revolution is the mode and driving force of social development. Without social revolutions in history, the process of replacing any given social economic formation with a new, higher level social economic formation would not have taken place. It is thanks to social revolutions that fundamental contradictions of society in the fields of economy, politics, culture, etc. have been resolved. Human history has fully and clearly demonstrated the role of social revolutions that have taken place in the past millennia. And then Engels describes important factors of capitalist revolution. Severance of the producer from the means of production. Condemnation of the worker to wage labor for life. Antagonism between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. Contradiction between socialized organization and the individual factory, and social anarchy and the production as a whole. These two levers of production and of social well-being are unable to work together because the capitalist form of production prevents the productive forces from working and the products from circulating unless they are first turned into capital, which their very superabundance prevents. The contradiction has grown into an absurdity. The mode of production rises in rebellion against the form of exchange. And then Engels started talking about proletarian revolution. Solution of the contradictions. The proletariat seizes the public power and by means of this transforms the socialized means of production, slipping from the hands of the bourgeoisie into public property. And that's the end.
All right, and then tomorrow we'll pick up on the last chapter, it looks like. Chapter 6, Historical Materialism Viewpoints about humans and the history-created roles of the masses. Oh, that's what we'll start with tomorrow. All right, everybody, does anybody have any questions or anything like that? Comrade Scientist, love that. That's a good name. Anybody have any questions at all before we close down the thing? Doesn't look like it. All right, then. Well, all right. Well, go ahead and close it out for the night. I hope everybody has a good night. Talk to you tomorrow. Good night.